So welcome, aloha everyone. My name is Christy Gavella and I'm the director of the Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs and an assistant professor of Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And we're so delighted to have you for today's Careers in Asia Pacific Affairs Speaker Series event. So the Speaker Series brings professionals from different fields to campus to bring bridges between students and future prospective employers and gives them a chance to understand a little bit more about all of the diverse things that they can do with knowledge about Asia. So today's event is co-sponsored by the Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, the East Asia National Resource Center, the Center for Pacific Island Studies, and the Department of Asian Studies. So we're so delighted to have with us today Dr. Ken Haig, who is Head of Energy and Environmental Policy for Asia Pacific and Japan at Amazon Web Services. And he is going to tell us a little bit about his job today. Ken was born and raised in Hawaii, and he's currently based in the Tokyo office of Amazon Web Services and travels extensively throughout the Asia Pacific region addressing energy and environmental policy. Before he joined Amazon Web Services, Ken helped to launch the Asia Pacific business for O-Power, which is a startup that pioneered the blending of behavioral science and data science to promote large-scale energy management programs. Prior to that, he was a US-based academic, teaching and researching comparative politics and public policy at UC Berkeley, Harvard University, and Bard College. And Ken will tell us a little bit about his academic journey during today's talk. So without further ado, we want to just run this like a talk show style panel. So I'll talk to Ken for a little while, and then we'll open up the floor to questions from the live audience, both in person and online. So Ken, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your current position and what you do on a regular basis?
Sure thing. So as Professor Govella mentioned, I was born and raised here in Hawaii. My path to my current role was routed through academia, which is where we overlapped. I graduated from high school here, went to college on the mainland, then went on to do graduate work at UC Berkeley in political science. There was, for a time, I was an academic teaching and researching on comparative politics, as was mentioned, but shortly after the Fukushima disaster in Japan in 2011, I was on a research project in Japan to help identify paths to plugging the gap between the third of power that was coming from nuclear before the Fukushima disaster and trying to find a path to promote renewables, energy efficiency, and all sorts of other clean energy transition absent nuclear in Japan. And that was sort of applied policy opportunity. At the time, I was on sabbatical from my teaching role in the US. But then around that time was when the O-Power team set up shop in Japan. And what O-Power was doing was they were working with utilities to take all the data that they had on consumers. And so essentially with smart meters in every home and business across Japan today, you can give very tailored recommendations to individual households around what they can do to save energy in ways that make sense for their usage profiles. You might here in Hawaii have gotten reports from Hawaii Energy that sort of compares you to neighbors and encourages you to find ways to do more on energy efficiency. That's the kind of work that O-Power was doing. Actually, that was pioneered by O-Power. So we brought that to Japan. Initially, it was a project with the Japanese government, working with 5 of the 10 utilities across Japan. I tried to take extended leave from my academic position at the time, and I couldn't convince my fellow faculty members to continue to support me as I was away. So I ended up having to make the transition full-time into the O-Power role at the time. That company was acquired by Oracle eventually, and then shortly afterwards, AWS came talking. And what AWS was looking for those who aren't familiar, AWS is the cloud computing business within Amazon. We're on Zoom here today. So Zoom is an AWS customer, and they are very dependent on our decarbonizing our energy use associated with running our data centers in order for Zoom, for example, to be able to reduce their carbon footprint, right? Because most of their business is run in the cloud, all this teleconferencing that we're doing. My role is to help find enough renewable energy for us to be able to move all of our energy use to renewables. And that's very challenging in the Asia-Pacific region. It actually turns out that there's a lot of policy blockers in terms of getting access to sufficient renewable power. That's where I started. In my role was focusing on access to renewables and trying to create a policy pathway for us to get there. I've since had other sustainability topics added to my portfolio. So I'm covering water. We have a 2030 goal, not only to get to net zero carbon, but we're getting to water positive, which means that we're going to be returning more water than we consume to the communities in which we work. And why water? For data centers, it turns out that one of the most efficient ways to cool data centers is by using water for cooling. Historically, it was evaporative cooling. But nowadays, with AI and machine learning workloads, there's a lot of compute power, and it runs hot enough that you actually have to have direct-to-chip liquid cooling. And so it involves a fair amount of water use to make sure that we're using as little energy as we need to. But we want to make sure that we're not using water at the expense of water as a resource for communities. And so finding access to recycled water, contributing to water replenishment programs is another part of what I'm doing, and working with policymakers to create pathways for us to do more of those kinds of community projects.
Got it. So what does that look like on a daily basis? Like, what kinds of activities do you find yourself doing?
So right before I was here, we were in Australia, where there's increasing concern about water scarcity there. So from the water perspective, actually while I was there, we had these major rainstorms, but the long-term trend is that because of climate change, we're headed towards increasing water scarcity, or these huge cycles of intense rains and then deep gaps where we have drought. And so how can we ensure that we continue to use as little energy as possible for our data centers while not impacting local water supplies? And one of the ways that we've tried to do that is to create a water crediting scheme. So working with the New South Wales state government there, during the Sydney Olympics, if you remember the Sydney Olympics in the early 2000s, they had built out a lot of recycled water infrastructure. So it's basically taking sewage and treating it to the stage where you can use it for other purposes. So in Singapore, for example, they've gotten to the point where they can actually treat sewage to the point where they can add it back to the drinking water supply. Sydney's not quite there, but there's a lot of use opportunities. So for data centers, it's plenty clean for us to be able to use that for cooling. The problem is it's limited to just around the Sydney Olympic Park, because that's where they made that initial investment. So what we're proposing to do is extend that recycled water infrastructure so that others can use it, us included. And we would count that towards our water positive goal, right? Because we're no longer using drinking water, we're using recycled water. The challenge is we want to do so in a transparent and accountable way. And so we're working with the New South Wales government to create a monitoring and crediting system where they can work with us to ensure that we're not overclaiming what we're actually able to produce in terms of recycled water resource. And so that was a topic that we engaged on there. We're going to have a convening next month in Bali with the World Water Forum. And then in June in Singapore International Water Week, we're bringing together all of these regional water policy stakeholders to do a workshop around what we're doing in Australia to try and have others replicate that process for us in other jurisdictions.
Interesting.
So that's one example from the water field. Yeah.
Right. So in what ways does your current position require knowledge of Asia? It sounds, tremendously interdisciplinary in a way, because you're dealing with the environment, you're dealing with different kinds of governments and political structures, social structures. So tell us a little bit more about how you use, your extensive background in Asia in this job that you're doing today.
Yeah. So I wish I could speak more Asian languages than I do. As partly, I would say, for the students online and for those in the room here, the investment you're making in terms of gaining not only the language knowledge, but the cultural knowledge in terms of navigating different cultural contexts, super, super important. I can do fairly well in Northeast Asia. I have enough Japanese, some Chinese to cover work in, say, Taiwan, Japan. I'm trying to learn Korean to get more on speed there, but that's playing catch up. I ended up having to work with the teams on the ground who are driving a lot of the discussions that we have. In places like Southeast Asia, there's, particularly with high-level bureaucrats, a lot of them will speak English. But when you start getting into sort of middle tier of people who are actually implementing programs, and once a regulation has been passed, how it's implemented becomes really important. That's where you really need the local language to be able to communicate with them. So I wish I could speak Bahasa. I wish I could speak Thai. There's a lot of, I wish I had gone back and spent more time in investing in language. But I would say that what I did invest has been super helpful, particularly in the Japanese context, where even at the high level, they don't speak a lot of English.
Right. And so you are particularly a specialist in Japan, not only in the language, but also in the, politics and society of that. So how does that help you, particularly in dealing with these issues in Japan?
So one of the things I think that's been interesting is I used to be a political scientist, right? I still think of myself as a political scientist. I guess what we're doing now is applied policy, right? And so understanding how policymaking works has been very helpful in terms of trying to influence that process. For example, in Japan, you've had the same political party in power essentially since 1955, right? It's been the Liberal Democratic Party in place for a long time. So there's not a lot of electoral politics that you can influence in terms of changing the party's position on particular issues. We've really gone, straight to the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, the energy agency that sits under them, to try and influence decision-making there. And so that, knowledge of how the Japanese political system works has been very helpful. I think the other thing that has been, helpful in that regard, and this is true for the rest of Asia Pacific as well, is that, we assume that a lot of energy politics is like what we have here in the US, where you have a utility that's been granted a natural monopoly by the regulator, but there's policymakers who are setting policies. The regulator implements those policies and then monitors how the utility is operating underneath those policies. It's a lot less clear-cut in the Asia-Pacific region, because in many cases you've got these large monopoly utilities, even bigger than Hawaiian Electric, right? So, Japan has 10 utilities. Indonesia, a country of 7,000 islands and a population the size of the US, has one utility that serves the entire island chain. So these can be very large, sort of dinosaur-like institutions that can be challenging to influence and change thinking on. But that understanding and thinking about how you can use different kinds of political levers to influence thinking, even within these very slow to change resistant organizations, I think has been useful. It's a good sort of applied use of that political science work that we have done since our graduate days.
Great. So what do you find the most rewarding about your job? And what are some of the greatest challenges that you face?
So one of the things I loved about my academic career was teaching and working with students who were super passionate about some of the causes that we're addressing now. I miss that part. I think what is rewarding about the role that I have now is that we are having a direct influence, I think, in terms of a lot of the changes that are needed in order to get to, say, a net zero carbon society, right? So Amazon, people are aware, it's a very large company. It has a lot of scale behind it, right? Amazon is the world's largest purchaser and consumer of renewable energy around the world today. So that gives us sort of outsized voice when it comes to trying to influence policies to create more opportunities for us to develop more renewables projects, right? And so that has been pretty rewarding, I think. There's actually a leadership principle. So Amazon has all these leadership principles that they use to sort of guide how the company culture works. And one of which is around using the fact that, with success and scale comes broad responsibility. And this focus on not only being very public about our sustainability goals, but also trying to bring others along for the work is a very much part of what I'm encouraged to do in my role. And so it's not just my company or myself alone, going back to sort of the political science applications, thinking about how collective advocacy approaches can work. That's something that I've spent a lot of time on as well. So trying to bring other companies that also have large 100% renewables goals or net zero carbon goals that are in time with ours. We've also been working with suppliers across the region. So think about, for a company like Amazon, for the cloud computing business, we use a certain amount of electricity ourselves to run our data centers. There's a fair amount of energy that's required to manufacture the semiconductors and other equipment that we use in our data centers. We need to get all of them onto clean, non-emitting, renewable energy resources as well. And so recruiting companies like TSMC, like Samsung into a coalition. Last year, we helped to found this coalition called the Asia Clean Energy Coalition. And it's precisely this idea to bring all of these corporate voices together and trying to influence local or regional governments to open up more paths to investing in renewable energy. That's what I guess I find rewarding, is that we're having an impact. And in part, it's the applied lessons from political science and from policymaking that we were sort of thinking about in theory and putting that into practice, and seeing results in terms of the policy change that we're able to achieve. I think that's rewarding.
Definitely sounds like it is, to see that kind of impact of, your daily work, and also to build these coalitions with others who share, your concerns, and also to, build that shared consensus about what the issues are. It sounds like that's, really rewarding pathway.
And it's, a small policy change can unlock a lot of opportunity. So to give you an example of this, in India, I've been in this role now for 4 years. When I started, the only opportunity to purchase renewable energy in India was to invest in, you essentially had to become a power company. And Amazon is many things, but we're not at the scale where we can be our own power company and build our own power plants and own, maintain, and operate them. So what we worked with the government there to do is to try and create not only a means of corporates being able to invest in renewables projects directly with developers, so build projects for us. We're not energy experts, we're not in the business of building power plants, but many are, with the renewables background that we need. So hire them to own, maintain, and operate these projects in what's called a long-term power purchase agreement. So essentially we agree to offtake power, say 15, 20 years for the lifetime of this plant, in exchange for the developer building and maintaining and operating that plant. What we would need in exchange is not just the power from those projects, but we also have, the whole reason we're purchasing renewables is because we have a net zero carbon goal that we have to be public and accountable as to how we're achieving. And so the environmental attributes from those projects are a really important part of how we do that accounting. And that requires government to invest in a renewable energy certificate scheme, or a guarantee of origin scheme. Long story short, we spent several years working with the Indian national government and with a number of state governments to try and create both of those mechanisms. So a means for us to invest with developers and also to get those environmental attributes. Once we unlocked those, in 2 years alone, we've been able to enable more than a gigawatt of new renewable capacity in India. And so to give you a sense, I don't know if you've seen Back to the Future, that 1.21 gigawatts, right? We've enabled more than that, right? In India alone, that's, we could replace 3 coal power plants with the amount of energy that we've now created. So once you get the right policy conditions, there's a fair amount of scale that can come with that. And so that's, I think, an example of how a small policy change can have big results.
So if students are, really excited by the things you're talking about and trying to make this kind of an impact, what would you say are perhaps 2 to 3 core skills that might be important for them in thinking about the things that you do? So obviously you came into this role and you didn't have specific training in, energy and environment policy.
I'm still not an electrical engineer. I don't have any background in energy as an engineering problem.
Right. So how can they think about trying to accumulate skills that might put them in a position to be in a job like yours? Like what kinds of personal or academic skills might be important?
So I think one thing that's worth thinking about is that for everyone in a liberal arts education, if you're in the social sciences or if you're in the arts or in the natural sciences, there are applications for getting involved in sustainability. It's a huge topic. It runs across so many different disciplines. My role has been very limited to sort of the political side of things, right? How do we change policies to create opportunities for the experts who will build these projects, right? Who will do all this carbon accounting. My role is a very small one within that. There are a lot of people who could be addressing other parts of that problem. And I think that's really what it is start with the problem solving element of it, right? You're all being trained to identify a problem, ask questions, right? And then investigate, the answers to those questions. That's a really valuable skill. And it's amazing to me how many of my colleagues who are born and raised in the Asia-Pacific environment, where I think, particularly in Northeast Asia, where I spend a lot of time, a lot of the training that they've had has really been sort of, focused on sort of memorizing specific sort of bits of information for college entrance exams, and it's less around the critical thinking aspects that I think is such a strength at what all of you are engaged in here. And so whatever the discipline is, just thinking about what you've learned as to how to be a critical thinker, approach a problem by working backwards from the problem and thinking about how do you address it, is a really valuable skill.
So then on this theme, so obviously you didn't take kind of a direct route to your job either. You had several different paths you could have pursued, et cetera.
Yeah.
So if students are interested in pursuing a career like yours, what advice might you give them? So you said build critical thinking skills, but are there, certain kinds of activities or things they can pursue? Or is there something perhaps that you wish you had known when you were a student, that would perhaps help to lead them in the direction that you've taken?
So one of the things, while I've been here at UH for the last couple of days, I've had meetings with different faculty members, I've met with different students, but I've also met with other groups that are working in Hawaii on this sustainability topic. And one of the things I wish I had known when I was younger was that Hawaii is a laboratory for so many different approaches that matter well beyond these islands. So for example, on the energy issue, Hawaii was the first state in the US to set a 100% renewable energy target. And in fact, I think Hawaii's on track to get there 5 years early. So it's a 2045 target. I think Hawaii will get there by 2040, if not sooner. And that was a huge exercise. It wasn't simple to do, but once you set a target like that, it requires that all of the different parties behind that effort, whether it's Hawaiian Electric, whether it's the state government, whether it's all of the renewables developers and the community activists and others who are trying to make sure that, when projects are located, it's, with the environmental justice and the communities that are engaged in the process. It's a long road to hoe, and it's by no means a settled issue. But by setting that ambition in the first place, Hawaii has really sort of created a model for others to follow. And one of the groups that I met with while I was here was a group called Elemental Accelerator, which started as a state sort of incubator space for startups. But the idea was to try and bring different startups to Hawaii, use Hawaii as a laboratory for testing different approaches that then could be exportable to other jurisdictions. Well, the whole reason why that opportunity exists is because Hawaii has set a really high and ambitious target for renewables, as an example. They're also doing work around agriculture and thinking about how can you have sustainable agriculture. I think there's a lot of opportunities with thinking about how sustainability can be incorporated into tourism, for example, here. There's just so many applications that I think Hawaii offers as a learning space for testing different elements of sustainability, no matter what your discipline is, that I wish I had taken more advantage of when I was younger and growing up here. So that's one.
Mm-hmm. So looking for those opportunities close to home and trying to figure out, what's going on around you and perhaps how also to get involved if they're interested.
And not selling yourself short. I think no matter what your discipline is, you have a lot to contribute, right? So I talked about, just how I wish I had more language skills. For those of you who are investing that time as Asian studies students, it's incredibly valuable. That language skill can navigate you across, business environments, policy. You can do arts, you can do whatever. It's not something that you can do later on in life, though. It's harder to pick up those languages later in life. So that's one I wish I had spent more time investing in languages, but what I did has been useful. And I think just, thinking creatively about what you have to leverage. I mean, you have expertise no matter what your field is. I think I was telling some of my the students that we met yesterday, one of my former students has come to work at Amazon Japan. She's not in the cloud computing business. She's not even in e-commerce business. She's with Amazon Studios. Right? So Amazon Studios is like many of these video content developers trying to find more local content. And she was a sustainability focused student in the arts at the time, but now she's trying to promote more content that's sort of taking advantage of traditional knowledge and traditional practices and putting that into a media environment that Japanese consumers will appreciate and make that part of the Amazon Studios work there. There's just so many different applications for people with an Asian studies background to do work in the Asia-Pacific region. I think, I'm not sure if we've done enough to identify sort of what are the opportunities in business as well as academia, as well as in government that you can go into. So,
well, I mean, it sounds like essentially there are opportunities everywhere. It's just a matter of how to find that connection and to find your passion for what you want to do.
Yeah.
So as you mentioned, growing up in Hawaii, were there activities that you think were particularly helpful that you did know about in building the professional profile that you have today? For those who are here and are thinking about, what they can do. So, you already mentioned looking around for all of the great things that are going on with climate and sustainability work and energy, renewable energy, et cetera. Are there other things that you would recommend?
So I would definitely recommend, if you can, I was hearing today that a lot of Hawaii UH students come into UH with the ambition to study abroad. So like 70% of students come in intending to study abroad, but in practice, very few actually get the opportunity. I think that's such a shame because the opportunity to study abroad, I think, really did influence me in terms of where I've gone. And I was a beneficiary of a number of different fellowships to do that. So that's maybe one thing that I might encourage people to look out for is fellowship opportunities for you to go and do work in another country. That experience beyond the classroom, I think, is incredibly valuable. And the variety of fellowships that are available now is really increased. It crosses all these different disciplines. I was really keen to hear how sustainability is a topic that's now crossing so many different disciplines here at UH. And there should be scholarships, fellowships that will help you in leveraging that. I think that's maybe something that students should feel free to talk to faculty about, is whether there's an opportunity for them to use one of those to help do more study abroad. We've also talked about internships here. And if any students are interested in internships with a company like Amazon, I'm happy to connect students to those opportunities. Right now, a lot of our, at Amazon anyway, our internship opportunities are really located in the US. We're trying to scale those into Asia Pacific region as well. And I would encourage you to look for opportunities to do internships as well as study abroad. If there's a part of the world that really interests you where you think you might want to go and not just study, but to live and potentially work someday, think about ways that you can get there using an internship opportunity as well.
That's great. So for students who are, obviously they're at many levels. So perhaps for students who are just starting out, who are at the bachelor's degree level and haven't yet, invested in a graduate degree, for example, are there entry-level opportunities for folks who have BA degrees that you could perhaps talk a little bit about? Obviously, if they go on to graduate school, that might open up more things. But, I think many people would appreciate just having a sense of after graduation, where can I go? Like, what do I do?
Well, so I think that your options increase, right, with a graduate degree. There's no question of that. So if you know that you want to go into a particular profession and you know that a graduate degree will help you there, I certainly wouldn't delay too long your path to that. But I think for a lot of students, understanding after your undergraduate years, where do you go is a challenge. It was for me too. So before I went to graduate school, I think I was telling you this. So I did a Fulbright year in Japan after I graduated from college. And that was the same year that in Japan they created this NPO law. It was the first time that there was an opportunity for nonprofit organizations to organize and create sort of, policy advocacy or community engagement opportunities. So I got really interested in that topic and ended up going to work for a community organizing group called Japan-US Community Education and Exchange. The acronym was JUICY, which I kind of liked as an acronym. But the whole point of them was to try and bring together people who were working on similar topics on both sides of the Pacific to collaborate And some of those were around environmental projects. Some of those were around how do we work with aging societies, places where seniors are living longer, but also working longer and trying to stay healthy longer. Multiculturalism and immigrant communities. We don't think of immigration as a challenge in Japan in the same way that we do in the US, but it is in some parts of Japan. You've got lots of foreign workers who are coming in to fill different roles. And so bringing together different communities that are community organizations working with those kinds of problems was the whole point of this Japan-US Community Education Exchange. I worked for them for 3 years. It was an entry-level position. But I learned a lot about all those topics through those roles. My role was program manager. I essentially helped to arrange those different exchanges. And that directly fed into what I ended up doing in my graduate program, which was focusing on politics and the way that civil society can influence politics. So the opportunities are there. I think if you look for them, you can learn a lot on the job. And I think if you have an interest in a topic and you have an opportunity to, even as a program manager or some sort of position that will give you broad exposure to a lot of different parts of that topic, take it.
So when you think about the positions or the people that you work with, both at Amazon, perhaps in your collaborators, et cetera, do most people have graduate degrees or do they have bachelor's, or does it vary widely?
It varies widely, yeah. So if I think, so my world is a little bit more narrow, right? Because I'm working in the world of policy. I would say it's a mix. About a third of my colleagues actually have a background in government. So they've served in government in one of the countries that we work in. Some of them have graduate degrees like myself. I wouldn't know if it goes quite to a third. A lot of them have, if not a graduate degree, they might have a degree in business, or they've worked for a consultancy, like around policy consulting. That seems to be another common path. It's not that you have to have a graduate degree necessarily, but you do have to have some sort of postgraduate work experience that I think is relevant, and particularly for the roles that when you move up in seniority. So the way that people often use me on the public policy team. So let's take a step back as to how the public policy team works. We have a broad group of generalists who are on the ground in every country, right? Who speak the local language, who know the local political system. They're generalists. They are asked to help arrange meetings and interpret and set the agenda. But then they bring in a quote unquote subject matter expert like myself to come and guide the discussion, right? Or provide the strategy for how do we get this policy change that we need to get changed. So my role is sort of at the periphery of that. The people who are driving a lot of that day-to-day engagement with the government, they don't have graduate degrees for the most part. They might have some experience in government. They might have worked with like a nonprofit or a civil society organization that had a lot of engagement with government, but it's the work experience that I think is really driving a lot of the expertise that they've developed. Right?
And you were mentioning sort of the more entry-level roles, perhaps like program managers or more administrative roles that may support folks like that, for example. So those might be things, in addition to getting internships or work experience in related fields, perhaps seeking, again, those kinds of entry-level positions, even in civil society organizations or nonprofit organizations that would give them exposure, perhaps would be useful.
So the woman who leads our public policy organization in the Asia-Pacific region, she came from the US ASEAN Business Council, right? So these, think of like the chambers of commerce or these regionally focused, sort of business-focused organizations or NGOs like Japan-US Community Education Exchange, right? I think that kind of experience can certainly be as useful in addition to graduate work.
So at this point, we can open it up for questions from the online and in-person audience, if there are any. So I have a question while they're thinking. Unless there was something you wanted to add.
No, go ahead.
So perhaps it sounds like, you're working in, or first of all, tell us a little bit about like which countries you've worked in, because I mentioned that you travel extensively, but
Yeah.
give us a sense of all the different places you've been. And perhaps if you could highlight one project that you are particularly excited about or that you think is particularly interesting, that would be great.
I cover Asia Pacific is my designation, but I think in terms of time zones, right? So New Zealand, Australia to the east, and then India to the west. This is how my day starts, right? I wake up early to talk to the Australian, New Zealand folks if I'm sitting in Japan, and then I stay up late to speak with the India folks at the end of the day. But in the middle, there's a lot of activity as well. So just this year, for example, in 2024, Amazon Web Services will be launching new data center regions in Malaysia, in Thailand, in Taiwan. And that complements existing regions that we have in Japan, Korea, Singapore, Indonesia. I mentioned Australia, New Zealand, India as well. So I spend a lot of time, frankly, these days in the countries that we're most focused on getting, because we're launching new data centers in Malaysia, Thailand, and Taiwan, and yet we don't have a path to 100% renewable energy in any of those countries yet. So that's a big concern for me. We're very dedicated to making sure that we get to that 100% renewable energy goal, and I'm personally responsible if we don't have a path to getting there. So that's I think where I'm spending a lot of my time these days, particularly in Southeast Asia. Some examples of projects, and so one of the things that I think has been really interesting is as we think about how do we get to net zero carbon, right? There's a lot that we can do in the energy space. So for those who are familiar with carbon accounting, there's sort of three buckets of carbon that we have to abate. The first is scope one. It's any fuel that we use towards our operations. Larger Amazon has planes, they have shipping, they have delivery. So that's a huge concern. Like, how do we get all of that to zero carbon fuels? It's really challenging. For AWS, the bulk of our emissions are coming from electricity use. That's scope 2 emissions, right? So anything that we're generating in terms of emission because of our energy use, we can abate by moving to renewables. That's the whole point of getting onto renewables. But we have to use renewables that are net new, above and beyond what's available on the grid today, in order to be able to make that claim that we're having a decarbonization impact with the investments that we're making. So that's where I spend most of my time. However, there's a whole nother bucket of scope 3 emissions. And so everything that goes into manufacturing parts, you think upstream, downstream. For Amazon devices, they also get enough energy to cover the lifetime of any products that you're purchasing from Amazon. So if you have a Kindle or a Fire Stick or an Echo speaker or any of these others, they're not only purchasing enough renewable energy or trying to find ways to offset that carbon for whatever we can purchase electricity towards, that covers not only the manufacturing of that device, but also what's used over its lifetime. So because of that complexity, in addition to looking at ways that we can get to net zero carbon through renewables purchases and other areas like that, we've also been looking at how can we use carbon markets as a means of creating real carbon reductions that are measurable, but also create opportunities for local communities to benefit from corporate investments in those kinds of programs. And so we've been talking about, for example, investments in nature-based solutions. One of the most, not innovative, it's nature's best way of absorbing carbon is through trees, right? Or through plants. And we were talking before this about how mangroves are sort of the unsung hero of not only carbon mitigation. So mangrove trees will absorb up to 10 times the carbon that trees on land do. They're also the unsung hero of carbon, of climate adaptation, right? There's a lot that mangroves can do to absorb the rising sea levels, right, that are coming from climate change. We're seeing oceans rising. We're seeing more intense storms. We're seeing more intense coastal flooding. And particularly in Southeast Asia, for example, 80% of communities live within a coastal flooding zone. 2/3 of the world's mangroves restoration opportunity sits in Southeast Asia. And so that's a nice marriage of needs, right? Is how can we invest in mangroves reforestation projects that will not only help us to reduce the amount of carbon that's in the air and apply some of that towards our scope 3 emissions. How can we also benefit local communities? Because for local communities, they don't care about carbon per se, right? But what they do care about is for fishermen, having more sustainable fisheries, right? Having an ecosystem that mangroves create. A lot of that was destroyed when mangroves were either, cleared for development or for shrimp farming or for other purposes. If we can restore that, it creates more opportunities, not only in terms of planting, which local communities get paid for, but then the ongoing benefits of those mangroves in terms of sustainable fisheries and in terms of preventing damage to coastal communities. That is a further challenge. We were speaking in your class yesterday about how, in many cases, the biggest tragedy with climate change is that those who are least responsible for the effects of climate change are the most vulnerable to its effects, right? We, as the advanced industrial economies of the world, have done the most to pollute and put all the carbon that's in the air today, and that's impacting the environment in a way that communities that are still developing are the ones that are suffering most. So it's a responsibility that we have, right, to be doing more of these kinds of projects that are not only mitigating the impact that we've created as the emitters, but also benefiting communities that are most vulnerable as the sufferers of climate change. Yep.
The question, yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haig, for sharing your experience. My question is on making mistakes. So I think what you're sharing is really exciting for me to hear, and I think for our students to hear as well, but also intimidating at the same time because you've already accomplished so much, it sounds. And I sat with you on Monday, so I'm aware also. But what would you say might be like some failures that students might, sometimes feel, one mistake I can't go forward, that you want to share from your personal experience?
It's nice of you to say that you think we've accomplished a lot. I think I'm frustrated with the lack of change in the time that I've been in this role. So 4 years now, right? And in terms of countries that we've unlocked opportunity to create a path to 100% renewables, I would say, India was one example I called out as a success story. It's probably the lone success story in terms of countries where I feel confident that we're going to make our 100% renewable energy goal. In places like Japan or Korea, we've created a mechanism for corporates like Amazon to purchase renewable energy, but there's not enough supply to meet demand that's already there. We have a lot of work to do do that collective advocacy to get Japanese and Korean governments to set higher ambitions on renewables. We talked about this in your class yesterday. It makes no sense, right? If you think about, there's a lot of opportunity for countries like Japan and Korea that have no natural resources in terms of fossil fuels. They're importing all these fossil fuels, which creates a lot of emissions. They're burning these fossil fuels for power, which creates a lot of emissions. And there's all that money that's sent overseas to import, which could be kept at home and builds renewable power that, the investment stays and circles through the rest of the economy. You also are, better positioned to achieve the 2050 target that both Japan and Korea have set. And yet we've seen a lot of resistance to building more renewables. There's a lot of political hurdles, I think, to getting there. So those, for me, I don't know if it's a failure yet, but we have failed to set the bar higher when it comes to increasing supply. We've made marginal gains, but there's a lot of room to go. And the same is true for Southeast Asia. I mentioned, right, we've got, Malaysia, Thailand coming up this year. We don't have a path to 100% renewables there. We have some openings, I think, of opportunities that we've started to engage with government and try to bring others to the table, but it's a really slow process. And we were talking to some colleagues at lunch today, 2030 sounds like it's far away. It's not. It's 5 years away, right? We don't have time to wait on climate. That's the problem.
It sounds like there are a lot of things where if you stopped, they would be failures, but frustrations and like stumbling blocks that kind of occur on a regular basis, especially when you have such ambitious goals, ambitious and important goals. So I mean, I think that one thing students could perhaps take is that, these are things that everyone is struggling with, problems that they're struggling to solve, and that, on any given day, you might not feel like, you're getting that far with your goals, but there are these breakthroughs and there are these, trajectories that you're shaping in the long term, right?
Yeah, and I think that there's another challenge is that, there's only so many of me within my company, and my company has done a lot to try and, maximize resources that we can change these policies. I'm lucky to have the position that I do. Many companies don't have the same resources, right, to be able to devote people to try and change policies like this. But because there aren't enough people in roles like mine, the progress is even slower, right? We have to prioritize which markets. I would love to be able to cover all of those countries that I mentioned that I'm supposed to be covering. I can't practically do that as one person alone. We're trying to grow a team now to do more, but we need more of you in roles like this.
So one thing that has come up is sort of the roles of companies in doing this. So obviously you're at Amazon, which is a huge company.
Yeah.
And so, there are many companies, as you mentioned, that are smaller that don't have the opportunity or the, access perhaps that Amazon does. But, when you're thinking about the Asia-Pacific region, can you talk a little bit about the roles of governments versus companies in climate change policy? And the impression that we've gotten from talking to you is that, companies are the ones pushing this forward, but is this correct, or what has been kind of your observation?
So I think particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, there has been, I think, a lot slow. I mean, so if you think about, climate change and who's responsible, it's primarily, the advanced industrial economies of the West, right? So it makes sense that they should be the ones to set ambitious climate targets and try to get to those. That's the refrain that you'll hear from Asia-Pacific governments is, we didn't emit all this carbon. It's not fair to hold us to the same standard. And what you see is that the net zero carbon targets under the Paris Agreement, for much of the West is by 2050. Throughout much of East Asia, Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, it goes 2060, 2070, 2080 in the case of India, right? We won't have a habitable planet by 2080 if we haven't eliminated coal well before that, right? And so that's one of the challenges I think that's unique to Asia, is that even the most ambitious governments out there in terms of net zero carbon targets, many of them don't sit in the Asia-Pacific region, right? Ironically, I think a lot of companies, because we've tried to even get ahead of the US and European targets. So Amazon as a whole has a 2040 targets, 10 years ahead of the Paris Agreement targets. And that already is an ambitious target for a company that has as many complexities as Amazon does, but it's one that we've committed to try to meet. I get the challenge, right? And why it's challenging for governments in the Asia-Pacific region to make a more ambitious goal. But that's one of the big challenges for us, is that because our timelines are so different, we have struggled to get traction on some of these issues, right? We were talking about in Indonesia, for example, it's 60% of Indonesia's power comes from coal today. There's a huge part of the economy that depends on coal mining. And it's not just a carbon issue for them, it's a just transition challenge for them as well, right? Like, you have a lot of dependencies for communities that make their livelihood from coal, whole parts of the political economy that revolve around coal that you have to address. So it's understandable that there would be greater hesitation to phase out coal quickly and then to bring in renewables to replace that. There's also a whole utility model around how utilities want to keep running the assets that they have because they get a regulated return on that investment. They don't for renewables, which are typically built by independent power producers. And so there's a lot of challenges that you have to think about and complexities that you have to think about that help you to understand why regional governments have been less ambitious, a little slower on where they're trying to go. But that understanding alone doesn't solve my problem, right? Where we have a more ambitious goal. We were talking in your class yesterday about, how can regulation help, right? One of the things I think that's been really interesting to see in discussions with regional policymakers is in Europe, for example, they're in the process of putting in place what are called carbon border adjustment mechanisms. So the idea would be to tax, put a carbon tax on goods that are shipped to Europe, right? In terms of the amount of emissions that's associated with manufacturing something in, say, East Asia or in Southeast Asia, as opposed to if you had manufactured it in Europe, right? So the idea is not to create like an unfair trading scheme, but to tax the carbon emissions associated with generating a specific product. That has caught the attention of, say, Vietnam, for example, where a lot of manufacturing, because of tensions between the US and China right now, is moving into Vietnam. But for Vietnam to be successful as an exporter of all of these manufactured goods, they need to be able to meet that carbon border adjustment mechanism, come in below that, right? And so this is now having an opportunity for us to have conversations with the Vietnamese government around, well, we need to scale renewables, right? Because not just Amazons of the world, but our suppliers also need to get onto renewables in order for us to all be able to meet this requirement. So that's an example, I think, of where policy and regulatory change can have an impact even in the international setting from afar in the Asia-Pacific context. Of course, that's kind of unfair, right, for these advanced industrial economies to be passing that obligation on to the emerging economies. Another sort of flip side of this is I think we're starting to see more attention to the kinds of transfer of wealth from the global north to the global south that will have to come in order to enable that clean energy transition and enable a just energy transition. So I'm somewhat comforted by the direction that we're seeing, for example, with US and Japan focused on a just energy transition partnership for Indonesia. The idea is to try to find ways to invest in Indonesia's early decommissioning of coal and replacing that with clean energy as a replacement. There's been a similar effort now in Vietnam to support the efforts there. And I hope we see more of those kinds of arrangements. Those have a lot more impact than what we as one company can do to try to change government's thinking in the region.
So we have a few questions from the online audience. One person is a former member of the Hawaii Supreme Court and is saying that our court has established the constitutional right to a life-sustaining climate with a focus on preventing global warming to 1.5 degrees. Are you aware of any global climate protection plan courts can refer to that designates a specific plan to reduce enough carbon to avoid global warming to 1.5 degrees?
It's a great question. I'm not personally aware of a constitutionally granted right. This is a new topic to me. I know that there have been a number of court victories, right, around the community's right to protection from the natural disasters that come from climate change. I don't know how you enforce those. That's the challenge. To be perfectly honest, I don't know that 1.5 degrees is achievable at the rate that we are focused on currently. I think that was one of the outcomes of the last round of COP negotiations, where we couldn't even agree on phase out of fossil fuels as the simple strategy, right, for getting there. So if you can't even have one unified approach to phase out of fossil fuels, how are you going to regulate the right to stay below 1.5 degrees? I don't know how that works. So I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer the question, but I think one of the things that I've become sort of, while I continue to have a lot of passion to try to address some of the challenges that we're addressing, I'm also aware that we need to be very cognizant that everything that we're doing now on the climate mitigation front is going to have an increasingly limited impact, right? Because we're already at a point where whether we can stay under 1.5 or not, even if we stopped emitting today, is questionable, right? And if you have a chance to study more about sort of the effects of climate change, I think one of the things that's really challenging there is, the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere today, it's going to be there for hundreds of years, right? And already it's having a greenhouse gas effect on the climate. That doesn't go away if we stop emitting today. And I think that's the part that we also need to be thinking about is, whether we can stay under 1.5 or not is probably less the point. It's how much more emissions can we prevent from getting emitted in the first place going forward, but also how are we creating more climate adapted communities and infrastructure. And I think that's another topic that we ought to be spending time on as well, is particularly in Pacific Island communities, in Southeast Asian and coastal communities. This climate adaptation requirement is really important. We were speaking yesterday in your class about the Philippines, who are the first in the path of the increasing number of typhoons and increasing intensity of typhoons that we're seeing. That's only going to increase, right? Once in a 100-year storms are now once in a decade storms, which will become once in a 5 years, every 2-year storms. So this is the part that I struggle with, is I don't know how to regulate a right to staying below 1.5. I don't know how we get to stay below 1.5. I don't know how we encourage more adaptation, even as we're working on mitigation strategies, but we need to be doing everything at once.
Right. I mean, it is interesting how institutions such as courts are trying to innovate in these different ways and trying to basically use all kinds of mechanisms to, in whatever way possible, encourage or in some cases perhaps enforce some kinds of change that might relate to climate. So it's as you say, like it's a fight that's going on all levels.
We're building the airplane as we fly, so to say.
Exactly, exactly. So we have another question from the online audience asking about, as we're shifting towards renewable energy, what guidance can you provide to students who want to ensure that the activities that they're engaging in source renewables, that they are themselves legitimately green?
So I think the question is talking about, there's sort of two dimensions, right, as I'm reading the further context there. So one, when we look at how corporates like Amazon source renewable energy, one approach is you can simply go out and buy renewable energy certificates. So I mentioned that when we look for projects, we're looking for power and environmental attributes, right? We use the power to power our data centers. We use the environmental attributes towards our carbon accounting. Another path that some may use is to just purchase the renewable energy certificates from existing projects, right? So a lot of, while there aren't a lot of new renewables projects in the Asia-Pacific, there are in some Southeast Asian countries and in places like Japan, big hydroelectric projects that have been in place for 40, 50 years, right? And some of those utilities that run those projects will sell you renewable energy certificates saying that you're getting your electricity from a carbon-free source, it's hydropower dam. Now that's not incorrect, but one of the things that we have to be very careful about when you're making claims towards the carbon reducing impact of those investments is that it has to be new, additional power above and beyond what's available on the grid today. That's the standard that we use in our corporate renewable energy procurement mechanisms. I get that point that you need to be very careful about looking where those claims are coming from, right? Whether they're actually purchasing power from new projects or whether it's just the certificates. And then the other point I think is also that with the clean energy transition, we are looking at, in some ways, more environmentally impacting resource extraction. So, for example, minerals required for more batteries, right? And we need to think about when we're building renewables projects that we're not impacting the environment in an adverse way. We're very careful, for example, we've looked at primarily solar and wind projects to date. Hydropower projects tend to be very challenging, particularly if they're large in scale. They have a big environmental impact. Geothermal projects, there's a huge opportunity for geothermal in the Asia-Pacific region, but it requires actually drilling to get there. So how do we balance the environmental impacts of these clean energy solutions, which in the long term are the best outcome in terms of reducing emissions, while making sure that they're not having adverse impacts on communities, on the environment when we're building them?
Great. Well, we're just about out of time, but this has been such an interesting conversation, not only from the substance of these kinds of climate change and sustainability issues throughout the region, but also from the perspective of thinking about how students can engage in these issues and perhaps think about using their current skills in terms of liberal arts education or language and really trying to make a difference in the region and around the world in a very concrete way. So thank you so much, Dr. Haig. Please join me in giving